So, for every atom of every element on planet Earth, we can see a similar anatomy. It doesn't matter if you're talking about carbon or oxygen or sodium or phosphorus. What all you have in that atom of that element is some number of protons and some number of neutrons and some number of electrons that are swirling around in these different shells. And sometimes in the outermost shell, there are unpaired electrons. And those unpaired electrons make the atom unstable. Now, something you're going to hear me say again and again is that nature doesn't like unstable atoms. Nature seeks stability. Nature seeks equilibrium and stability. So, an atom is most stable when the valence shell is full, as we say, when all of the electrons in the valence shell are paired. The valence shell can resolve an unpaired electron by participating in a chemical reaction and forming a chemical bond with another atom. That's what we refer to as a covalent bond. All a covalent bond is a pair of electrons that are being shared by two atoms. That's all it is. We have two atoms and each one of them has an unpaired electron in its valence shell. Each one of those atoms needs a pair. So what do? They come together and they share their unpaired electrons. So now they each have a pair between them. That's a covalent bond. That will hold those two atoms together because they are more stable together than apart. Covalent bonds are strong bonds, stable bonds. It's covalent bonds that create molecules. So, for example, when two hydrogen atoms come together, each one of them has an unpaired electron. When they come together, they will share that pair of electrons. They will form a covalent bond together and become hydrogen gas, H2. Two hydrogens and a single oxygen atom can create H2O. There's a covalent bond between the oxygen and one hydrogen, and there's a covalent bond between that same oxygen and the other hydrogen. Shared electron pairs. That's all it is. So let's go back to those four elements I mentioned. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen. Those four elements make up 96% of all of the molecules that you will find in a living cell. Carbon, it turns out, has 4 unpaired electrons in orbitals in its valence shell. That means carbon can take part in 4 single covalent bonds. It can share those 4 unpaired electrons with 4 other unpaired electrons. It can create 4 what we call single covalent bonds. It's also possible not to form a single covalent bond, not to share one pair of electrons, but to form 2 covalent bonds or even 3 covalent bonds between two atoms. It depends on how many unpaired electrons there are in that shell. So, since carbon can have 4 single bonds, it could also take part in some combination of double and triple bonds, maybe 2 double bonds or one triple bond and one single bond. Any combination will work as long as it finds a mate for all 4 of those unpaired electrons. Nitrogen, in comparison, can make 3 single covalent bonds because it has 3 unpaired electrons in its valence shell. Oxygen has 2, and hydrogen has 1. So by knowing those 4 elements, we can know a lot about the molecules that they're capable of building around them, creating inside a living cell. On this slide, we can see that in action. We can see several different molecules depicted in terms of covalent bonds between atoms. If you look up at the top on the upper left, here we see a carbon atom, and we can see 4 single covalent bonds that have formed between that carbon atom and individual hydrogen atoms. Carbon can make 4 single bonds. Hydrogen can make 1. Remember, when we draw molecules this way, when we draw a straight line between 2 atoms, that represents a covalent bond. That's what we mean when we draw that. Right next door, you can see a depiction of carbon dioxide, 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. Now this is an example where instead of seeing 4 single covalent bonds, we see 2 double bonds. You still have 4 bonds here, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just that the carbon has made 2 bonds with this oxygen and 2 with this oxygen. Carbon can make 4, each oxygen can make 2. Here's water, here's oxygen gas. Each one of these oxygens can make 2 covalent bonds. Here's hydrogen gas that I mentioned a minute ago. Here's one of those triple bonds between 2 nitrogen atoms. Down here you can see a depiction of ammonia. This is how you often see it drawn, 1 nitrogen with 3 hydrogens. You may also see it drawn like this, though. I said a minute ago that when we draw a solid straight line, that represents a covalent bond. Sometimes, though, we draw the structure a little bit differently because we're trying to depict its 3-dimensionality. So by drawing it this way, these covalent bonds this way, the artist is telling us that this bond is coming out towards us in 3-dimensional space, and this bond is going away from us in 3-dimensional space. Lastly, take a look at this over here. This actually represents lactic acid. The other thing to know when we draw chemical structures is that we don't always draw every single atom. When you see a structure like this that has these black lines that are drawn with a zigzagging pattern, everywhere you see a point, so here and here, see that pointed area between 2 lines? You can know that there's a carbon atom there. So there's a carbon right here, and there's a carbon right here. Also, anywhere you see 2 atoms sitting side by side, but there's no black line drawn between them, you can still assume that there's a single covalent bond there. So down here we have carbon and 3 hydrogens. You can assume that there are single covalent bonds to each one of those hydrogens. If we're going to depict a double bond, we typically draw the double bond. So we have a carbon here at that point, and then a double bond to this oxygen. Now, We know that a covalent bond is simply a pair of shared electrons between two atoms. Now we need to talk about an interesting fact about covalent bonds, and that is that the electrons that are in that covalent bond are not always shared equally between those two atoms. In other words, some atoms are able to pull the pair of electrons closer to them and farther away from the other atom. They don't share evenly, they don't share equally. One of them is sort of hogging the pair of electrons. Now this is because atoms have a property known as electronegativity. And electronegativity is a property of each element. Electronegativity is a measure of how strongly a particular atom can pull electrons towards it with varying degrees of hold on those electrons. So what I've drawn here is our 4 key elements, and I've drawn them in order of their electronegativity. Oxygen, of the 4 elements, has the highest electronegativity. That means oxygen will pull a pair of electrons up close to it. Okay? It doesn't matter if the oxygen is covalently bound to nitrogen or to carbon or to hydrogen. The electron pair will always sit closest to the oxygen atom because it has the highest electronegativity. It's greater than all the rest of those 4 elements. Next in the list is nitrogen. So nitrogen has an electronegativity that is lower than oxygen, but higher than carbon and hydrogen. So it will pull an electron pair closer to it if it's bound to either carbon or hydrogen. Now the last 2 of our 4 key elements are carbon and hydrogen, and you'll notice that I don't have a greater than sign between them. I have a approximately equal sign between them. The truth is that carbon and hydrogen have slightly different electronegativities, but they are so close to each other in their electronegativity that we consider them as having the same level of electronegativity, and it's a low level. So carbon and hydrogen, for our purposes, have the same low electronegativity, lower than nitrogen and lower than oxygen. Now, why do we care about that? Why do we care about whether or not an atom pulls electrons closer to it or whether the electrons are farther away from it? Why do we care about that? Well, it turns out that how an electron pair is shared between 2 atoms will affect the chemistry of that pair of atoms. And by that I mean it will change how that pair of atoms behaves in a cell. For example, the unequal sharing, or what you could describe as asymmetrical sharing of electrons between 2 atoms, is what we call a polar covalent bond. So if you go back up to our scale, let's say there's a bond between an oxygen atom and a hydrogen atom. The oxygen has a much higher electronegativity than the hydrogen. So the pair of electrons that they're sharing is going to be much closer to the oxygen atom than the hydrogen atom. That is unequal sharing. That creates a polar covalent bond between those 2 atoms. In comparison, when there's equal or symmetrical sharing of 2 electrons, in a covalent bond, that's called a nonpolar covalent bond. For example, if we had a carbon atom that is bound to a hydrogen atom, those two atoms have about the same electronegativity, so they're going to pull equally on their pair of electrons, so those electrons are going to be equally shared. That's a non-polar covalent bond. On this slide, we can see a drawing of a couple of molecules. Up at the top, we have H2 or hydrogen gas, and down at the bottom, we have H2O or water. Now I put this drawing in because in addition to drawing that straight black line between the atoms, the covalent bond, the artist has also drawn in a pair of electrons, two little yellow circles. Remember, that's all that black line represents. That black line is a covalent bond. And all a covalent bond is a pair of electrons that those two atoms are currently sharing with each other. So, hydrogen covalently bonded with another hydrogen. Obviously, if the two atoms are the same, they're going to pull equally on the electron pair, but in opposite directions. So they're going to share that pair of electrons equally or symmetrically. That electron pair, in other words, is right in the middle between those two atoms. Compare that to a water molecule. Oxygen has a much higher electronegativity than hydrogen does. So in both of these covalent bonds, we can see a pair of electrons, but that pair of electrons isn't halfway between the oxygen and the hydrogen. It's much, much closer to the oxygen. The oxygen is pulling those electrons closer to it and farther away from the hydrogen. Now, there are symbols drawn on this water molecule that you don't see on this hydrogen. That symbol is a lowercase d or a delta symbol, and you'll notice that it has either a positive or a negative drawn with it. It's not that water has any charges. It doesn't. Water is a neutral molecule. But inside that molecule, there are what we call partial charges. In other words, there's regions of this water molecule that are more positive, and there are regions that are more negative. Why? Because there are regions where the electrons tend to reside, and electrons have a negative charge. This oxygen atom is surrounded by electrons. Two pairs of electrons are snugged up next to it, and they are bringing with them their negative charge. So this region of a water molecule is partially negative compared to these regions that are much farther away from those electrons. So they are slightly less negative or more positive. This is a partially positive area, and this is a partially positive area. Delta positive, delta negative. This molecule contains partial charges. This molecule contains polar covalent bonds. This molecule has no partial charges because this molecule contains nonpolar covalent bond.